So I guess it's time for another look back on a game I reviewed a couple of years ago. When I reviewed Resident Evil Revelations 2, it was still fairly new, so I decided to only review the first chapter as a way to avoid potential spoilers. But now it's been about 2 years, so I figured why not take a look at those 3 chapters as well as see if my thoughts have changed since then. So if you haven't yet, probably a good idea to watch my full review first, but let's get into it. In my opinion, I think Chapter 2 as a whole was the best chapter in this game because it showed in the best way possible that the choices you make in Claire's section can have a huge impact later on in Barry's portion, since what Claire does in Chapter 2 has the biggest consequences for Barry, which can mean the difference between Barry having a much easier time or being much more difficult for him. This all comes to whether or not Claire has enough firepower to take down Mutant Pedro, a character that unfortunately couldn't keep his cool during a previous enemy rush. This just works so well that it kind of made Chapter 3 and 4 kind of a letdown in this aspect. Granted, it's not like they don't do anything like this, but unlike 2 and, well, 1 for that matter, it just revolves around reaching a blocked off area to get a certain item. Nothing wrong with that, but not very engaging either. But aside from that, I really enjoyed Chapter 2. It introduced us to the first boss fight as I mentioned, some new enemies like the Vulcan Blubber and especially the Glasp. Like usually I'm not a fan of insta-kill enemies in video games due to how cheap they usually are, but much like the Reaper from Resident Evil 5, when Capcom does an enemy like this, they tend to do it well. Again, Barry said it perfectly.
Invisible monsters. Oh, that's gonna be fun.
Chapter 3 was a bit more open-ended, which involved Claire and Moira having to acquire pieces of meat for a statue. Yeah, I know, but it's kind of tame for Resident Evil standards when you think about it. Then it involves a pressure sequence where you have to have Claire and Moira work together to escape. Afterwards you explore the sewers for a bit, and then you reach an idea that I feel modern Resident Evil needs to adopt immediately. An actual puzzle that actually takes a little bit of fucking thinking, oh my god. Okay, I know with Resident Evil nowadays, the more intricate puzzles are probably never going to be common again with the more linear level design. Granted, 7 might be changing that, but that doesn't mean we have to have weak-ass puzzles or none at all. If you figure this one out, then you're rewarded with a new gun and a couple BP points. That's like the perfect way to incorporate puzzles into more action-oriented games. Make the player work for those better guns or items. I loved it. Lastly, for this part was the fight with Neil. Anyone who's played 6 will know that he's just a reskin Usanak, which I gotta admit is pretty lazy. But I will give him the benefit that it actually feels like a real boss fight, not just trying to outlast a behemoth. So it feels more rewarding when you figure out Neil's weak spot and take him out. Barry's Chapter 3 kinda dragged a bit in the first half in my opinion. That damn sluice part doesn't do the game any favors after the first playthrough. I know what they were going for, but the constant switching was a pain in the ass, and considering the fact that Claire and Moira did it a little bit better previously, about say 20 minutes beforehand, it definitely kinda leaves its mark, and not in a good way. Not to mention the first minute or two is just walking, again making it feel a lot slower. But I gotta give Barry's voice actor a lot of credit here. This character has been known as the meme machine for Resident Evil. It's corny line after corny line whenever he's appeared, which is why people for years wanted him to return in a starring role. And this was no exception here. He still drops those lines here and there, but to me it's believable now. You feel like this is who he really is. But the beginning of Barry's Chapter 3 was an amazing performance in my opinion. You can feel how broken this man is at this point. In his mind, he's failed to protect his kid. Anger, depression, sorrow. Yet still trying his best to cheer up his little companion despite the dire situation they're in. This guy nailed it here and he should be acknowledged for this performance. It's very touching. But as for the second half of Barry's third chapter, it was okay. It's not my favorite. But I do enjoy the more open-ended aspect with figuring out how to get this battery from spot to spot, as well as this boss fight with a mutated Revenant, which I recently learned that you can completely ignore it on the second fight. Wish I would have known that for the countdown mode. Now, Chapter 4 is kind of a hard one for me to decide if I really like it or not, mainly because of how unbalanced it is. When you start off, Claire and Moira are reaching Alex's headquarters and then they find her. Spoilers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She blows her fucking head off. Then another pressure sequence, then Claire has to ditch Moira due to rubble falling on her, which I gotta admit, I kinda laugh every time I see it. It's just so fast. I mean, like, put Benny Hill music with the scene and you'll see what I'm talking about. But then that's it. You could easily beat it under 12 minutes if you're quick enough. So another pressure sequence with no end boss? Hell, there's barely any enemies, so not that exciting. Barry, on the other hand, has to compensate for Claire's shorter chapter, and unfortunately, I think the length is what hinders the final part of the game. It just goes on and on and on. You got the drainage area, then the girder section that acts like a puzzle, the tunnels with the poisonous gas, the underground mansion, and the research center, then 2 boss fights depending on if you have the good ending. That's a lot for one playthrough with no breaks. Granted, I really liked those sections. When I got to the mansion, I was like, oh my god, that's so fucking awesome. But at the same time, I was burnt out and needed a break. But despite that, I honestly think Barry's Chapter 4 is my favorite chapter by itself. It has interesting spots, it's somehow linear and open, which is cool, and honestly, as a fan of Barry, this was a great way to end the game. I mean, look at that slow march. It's so campy and B-rated in presentation, but that's when Resident Evil's at its best in my opinion. So what's my final verdict? Honestly, I still enjoy this game quite a bit. It's not the best game we ever got for the series, but for a budget title that you can now get for even cheaper since the first chapter is free, it's more than worth the price it's asking for. But that's what impresses me the most, that this game was a budget title. It shows its limits, but you can tell they did the best they could with said limits. The main game reeks replayability and has an entire bonus mode to provide hours of gameplay. For $20 to $29, you can't go wrong with that.